Clara, stop dreaming about teaching again. Who would ever hire a 67-year-old housewife? Those words, sharp and deliberate, struck me harder than the chill of the autumn night outside. Richard didn't raise his voice, he never needed to. His sneer carried enough venom to wound me deeply, even here, in front of our daughter. The clink of wine glasses and the faint hum of Italian violins filled the upscale restaurant. But for me, everything froze. My fork hovered over the untouched risotto, my throat tight, my smile forced. I was an actress again, pretending that humiliation wasn't part of the script. Emily, radiant in her new blazer, the proud badge of her law career, laughed lightly. "Mom, maybe you could volunteer at the library instead," she said gently, though her tone carried the same quiet dismissal as her father's. Candlelight flickered on polished silverware, but inside me, something cracked. This dinner was meant to celebrate Emily's triumph, yet it became a stage where my own worth was mocked. That night I realized silence had been my heaviest chain, and Richard had always known how to tighten it. When we returned home that evening, the laughter from the restaurant still echoed in my mind, though it had turned sour, like a melody played off-key. I sat by the kitchen window long after Richard had gone to bed, the old colonial house resting in silence around me. The tall white columns outside caught the glow of the porch light, casting long shadows across the yard. They looked strong, immovable, everything Richard had wanted his design to be. But to me, they felt like prison bars, reminders of a life I had built for someone else. The mantel clock ticked steadily, each sound like a drop of water in a cave, marking time I could never retrieve. I thought about who I once was. Years ago, I had stood in a classroom, chalk in hand, watching young eyes widen as letters became words and words became stories. That spark, the joy of shaping futures, had burned bright inside me. Then Emily was born, and I let that flame die down, believing the words Richard spoke so confidently. "Clara, your place is here. The best thing you can do is be a mother, a wife." And I obeyed. I poured my energy into perfect dinners, spotless rooms, and cheerful smiles for his clients. Slowly, the woman who dreamed of teaching disappeared, replaced by someone who blended into the wallpaper of her own life. At the restaurant earlier that night, it became painfully clear. I was no longer Clara Johnson, a woman with her own light. I was a shadow seated at a table, my presence acknowledged only to be dismissed. Even my daughter, the child I had given everything for, looked at me through a lens clouded by pity. Emily's achievements shone like jewels under the chandelier, while I sat quietly, polishing silverware no one would remember. The next morning, the ritual continued, as if nothing had happened. I brewed coffee, placed the cup in front of my husband, and he nodded without looking up from the newspaper. His voice was flat, transactional. "The Mitchells are coming for dinner tonight." It wasn't a request. It was an expectation, another duty to be folded into my endless list. I nodded, like a servant who knows her orders well, and began planning the meal in my head. Days bled into weeks, and weeks blurred into seasons. I noticed how invisible I had become in every setting. At family meals, whenever I offered an opinion about politics, books, even something as trivial as a recipe, Richard's lips curved into that smirk, and Emily responded with a polite but vacant smile, the kind one gives a child who doesn't quite understand. It was not open cruelty, but something quieter, more suffocating, a steady erasure of my worth. At his company's grand Christmas party, beneath glittering chandeliers and laughter that flowed like champagne, I stood near the coat rack. My dress sparkled faintly under the light. But I may as well have been invisible. I overheard him in the next room, boasting to colleagues, his voice carrying with ease. "My wife still thinks substitute teaching is a career. Bless her heart." The laughter that followed cut through me like glass. I smiled politely as guests handed me their coats, my hands steady while my heart trembled. That night, when we left the party, he leaned heavily on my arm. The scent of whiskey clung to him. "You were useful tonight," he muttered, eyes half closed. Useful. Not beautiful, not strong, not cherished, just useful, like an appliance that had done its job. I stared out the window of the car as the city lights blurred into streaks, telling myself to stay quiet because silence had become second nature. Then came the winter, when his body betrayed him for the first time. The heart attack struck without warning, and suddenly I was his nurse, his caretaker, his steady hand. I measured pills, cooked bland meals, checked his pulse through sleepless nights. I hovered at his side, believing foolishly that this crisis might open his eyes, that perhaps he would finally see me as more than the background of his life. But the moment he regained strength, the mask slipped back into place. One evening, as I tried to help him walk across the living room, he brushed me away sharply. "Don't cling to me like some desperate housewife," he snapped. The words shattered the fragile hope I had been holding, leaving only silence in their wake. I called my sister Mary that night, whispering through tears while Richard slept in the next room. "I don't know who I am anymore," I confessed. "Just furniture that talks." She urged me to visit her, to stay a few days, to breathe outside these walls. But I couldn't. I was trapped by duty, by habit, by years of conditioning. I told her I was fine, though we both knew I was not. Everywhere I looked, reminders of my sacrifices haunted me. Friends from years past sent postcards from Europe or wrote letters about new hobbies, new loves, second chances. Some had picked up painting, others were writing books. A few had returned to school. Their lives bloomed in shades of color, while mine remained gray and predictable. I envied their courage, their freedom, their refusal to settle. Emily, too, was living fully, her name spoken in courtrooms, her confidence stitched into every tailored suit she wore. She would visit, share victories, and smile at me with that familiar mixture of affection and condescension, as though I were a fragile porcelain vase meant to be admired but never truly valued. I tried once again to speak of teaching. It was a quiet dinner, just the three of us at home. "There's a program at the community college," I said softly. "They need someone to help with reading skills, only a few hours each week." For a brief moment, I let myself imagine their support, maybe even encouragement. Instead, Richard chuckled into his plate, not even meeting my eyes, and Emily leaned forward with her lawyer's poise. "Mom, the professional world has moved on. You'd be happier volunteering at church or the library." Her words were gentle, but they landed like stones in my chest. I nodded, hiding the storm raging inside. Nights became the loneliest. While he slept beside me, snoring softly, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. In those hours, I thought of the girl I had once been, the young woman, with chalk on her fingers and fire in her eyes, eager to help children discover stories hidden between the lines of a book. Where had she gone? She had been folded away, stored like linens in a cedar chest, forgotten by everyone except me. One evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, my gaze fell on the mirror above the fireplace. A woman with silver hair and weary eyes stared back. For a moment, I did not recognize her. I leaned closer, searching for the Clara I once knew, not the wife, not the mother, not the dutiful hostess, but simply Clara. I touched the cool glass, as though I could reach through and pull her out. But the reflection remained still, trapped in her frame. Yet somewhere deep inside, a flicker remained. It was small, like the glow of a candle in a draught, but it refused to go out. I could not have known then what was waiting for me, that Richard's second heart attack would strike without mercy, that an envelope handed to me by a stranger would unravel more than 4 decades of carefully constructed lies. All I knew was that despite everything, a quiet voice whispered within me, "You are not done yet." The morning Richard's second heart attack struck was ordinary in every way, which made the collapse feel even more cruel. The coffee still steamed in his favorite mug. The newspaper lay folded on the counter, and the sky outside was just beginning to turn pink with sunrise. One moment he was adjusting his tie, muttering about a meeting he could not miss, and the next he was clutching his chest, his face drained of color. The ambulance wailed through the neighborhood, but by the time the doors swung open at the hospital, my husband of more than 4 decades had already slipped away. At the funeral, people spoke of him as though he had been a saint carved from marble. Words like brilliant, respected, visionary drifted through the chapel, wrapping him in a halo he had never worn at home. I sat stiffly in the front row, hands clenched in my lap, nodding when others leaned down to whisper condolences. The scent of lilies filled the air, sweet but suffocating, and the organ's heavy notes pressed against my chest. Emily stood tall beside me, her hand occasionally brushing mine, though her strength felt more like duty than comfort. I kept waiting for someone to speak of the man behind closed doors, the sharp tongue, the smirks, the way he had chipped away at me year after year, but no one did. They remembered the architect, not the husband. They remembered the generous host, not the man who mocked his wife in front of strangers. And so I remained silent, wearing the mask I had perfected over the years, allowing the performance to continue even as I grieved. It was after the service, when mourners had begun to leave, that a stranger approached me. He was a man in his late 50s, with dark eyes that seemed weighed down by secrets. He introduced himself quietly as Miguel Rivera, Richard's business partner. In his hands was a sealed envelope, worn at the edges as if it had been handled many times. "He asked me to give you this," Miguel said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "Only you." I stared at the envelope, my heart thudding. Why would Richard leave something for me through another man, instead of placing it in my hands before his death? That night, when the house was empty and Emily had gone back to her apartment, I sat alone in the living room with the envelope trembling in my lap. The brass key inside slid into my palm with a weight that felt heavier than metal. Along with it was a slip of paper, an address written in Richard's precise handwriting. My pulse quickened. A key and an address. What was I supposed to find? I debated with myself for hours, pacing the room as shadows stretched across the walls. Part of me wanted to burn the envelope, to leave the mystery buried with him. But another part, the flicker inside me that had survived his belittlement, urged me forward. And so, 2 days later, I drove across town to a building I had never seen before. It was a modest apartment complex, unremarkable except for the small garden blooming at its entrance. My hands shook as I slid the key into the lock of unit number 12. The door creaked open, to reveal a life I had never known existed. The furniture was warm and inviting, the walls adorned with photographs of Richard with another woman. She was younger than me, with dark hair and kind eyes, always standing close to him in every frame. My knees weakened, and I grasped the back of a chair to steady myself. Each picture was a blade, cutting away at what little certainty I had left. On the desk lay a stack of letters, some addressed to her, some to him, and then, at the very bottom of the pile, one envelope bore my name. I opened it with trembling fingers, my vision blurring as I read his handwriting. In the letter, Richard confessed to what I had always suspected but never dared to name. He had deliberately kept me small, chipped at my confidence, mocked my attempts to reclaim my identity, all to ensure I would never leave. He admitted that his affair had lasted decades, that the apartment had been his refuge, a place where he could live a second life untouched by me. And still, he wrote, he depended on my silence, my loyalty, my willingness to remain the dutiful wife in the shadows. The words swirled around me, burning my eyes, choking my throat. My grief shifted into something sharper, hotter. Anger surged through me, rising like a tide I could no longer hold back. For years I had doubted myself, questioned whether I was too sensitive, too needy, too foolish. But the letter proved what my soul had always known. I was never crazy. I was never imagining it. He had crafted the lies carefully, like one of his architectural blueprints, and I had lived inside them. I stumbled to the window, clutching the letter against my chest, staring out at the quiet street. The world looked the same, but inside me, everything had changed. The man I had mourned was not the man I had married. He was a stranger I had served faithfully, even as he carved away my spirit piece by piece. My tears fell freely then, not only for what I had lost, but for the years stolen from me. When I returned home that evening, I placed the brass key on the mantel, where the flicker of the fireplace caught its metallic edge. It looked almost beautiful, gleaming with betrayal. I knew then that this key, once a symbol of secrets, would not remain a weapon against me. I would carry it as a reminder of what I had endured, of the chains I was determined to break. Emily visited the following weekend, her eyes filled with concern as she urged me to consider moving into a retirement community. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone in that big house. It's too much for you." Her words, though softened with love, carried the same undertone of dismissal she had inherited from her father. I almost laughed at the irony. She had no idea what I now carried, no idea how my perspective had shifted. I nodded gently, hiding the letter for the moment, waiting until the time was right to reveal the truth. At night, lying in the bed that suddenly felt enormous without Richard's body beside me, I thought about the years I had spent in silence. I thought about the young teacher who had once believed in her own strength, and I thought about the letter, the key, and the apartment filled with photographs that did not include me. For the first time in decades, I felt something new take root in my chest. Not despair, but clarity. My life was not over. It had only been delayed, paused beneath the weight of a man's shadow. Now, I had the chance to step back into the light. The days after I discovered the apartment were unlike any days I had lived before. Grief still lingered like a heavy fog, but beneath it a new current stirred, a restless energy that would not let me sit still. I wandered through the rooms of my house, touching the walls Richard had once boasted about, but instead of pride, I felt only a hollowness. Those walls had not protected me. They had confined me. For years, I had moved through them like a ghost, polishing wood, dusting corners, arranging flowers, all to keep up the illusion of a perfect home. Now the illusion lay shattered, and what remained was bare space, waiting for me to fill it with something of my own. One morning, I opened the cedar chest in the attic, the one that had sat untouched for decades. Inside lay lesson plans, written in my younger hand, chalk smudges still faint on the margins, children's drawings given to me as tokens of affection, and a notebook where I had once scribbled ideas for lessons and stories. My fingers trembled as I held them, as though touching the pieces of a forgotten self. The scent of old paper rose up, earthy and familiar, and suddenly I could hear echoes of laughter, the sound of eager voices shouting answers in unison. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I was 24 again, standing in front of a chalkboard, with the world wide open before me. I began to imagine what it might be like to teach again, not in some grand school with stern administrators, but in a place where people needed me, adults trying to learn new skills, children who had slipped through the cracks, women like me who had once put their dreams aside. I searched online, fumbling with technology that felt like a foreign language, but slowly I learned. The glow of the screen became a companion at night, guiding me through job boards and teaching resources. My heart beat faster each time I clicked a listing, and though doubt still whispered too old, too late, there was another voice now, steadier, reminding me, "You are not done yet." When I finally gathered the courage to apply for a part-time position at the community college, my hands shook as I typed out the email. I half expected silence in return, but within a week I received a reply. They wanted to meet me. The day of the interview, I stood before the mirror and hesitated. The woman staring back wore lines on her face, silver in her hair, but her eyes held a spark that had been missing for so long. I smoothed my skirt, whispered a quiet prayer, and drove to the college. The campus buzzed with young energy, students rushing between classes, laughter echoing off brick walls. I felt both out of place and strangely at home. The interview itself was humbling. They asked about my experience, my ability to adapt to modern teaching methods, my comfort with digital platforms. I answered honestly, admitting my need to learn but promising my commitment. When I left, I felt drained, yet alive, like someone who had run a race after years of standing still. A week later, an email arrived with the subject line, "Welcome to our faculty." I cried as I read the words, tears spilling onto the keyboard, my chest shaking with a joy I had not felt in years. But my triumph was not celebrated at home. When Emily visited and saw the printed schedule pinned to the refrigerator, she frowned. "Mom, what is this? You're working now? At your age?" Her voice carried more concern than cruelty, but the undertone was familiar. She set down a stack of glossy brochures, their covers showing cheerful seniors in manicured retirement communities. "I think you should consider this instead. It would be safer, easier. You've already done enough." "Oh." Her words struck me with the same sting as her father's once had. But this time, I did not shrink. I invited her to sit at the dining table, the same table where I had spent years being silenced. I laid out the letter Richard had written, the financial records I had uncovered, the photographs from the apartment. Emily's eyes widened, her confident expression crumbling into shock. "Dad?" "No, he wouldn't." Her voice faltered as she read his confession, the truth spilling into her lap like cold water. I watched her struggle, the disbelief, the anger, the shame. For the first time, she looked at me, not as a fragile mother, but as a woman who had carried unbearable weight in silence. My voice, calm yet steady, broke the spell of our shared denial. "I don't need your permission to live my life, Emily. I was never the helpless woman you imagined. Your father wanted me to believe that, and maybe you did too, but no more." The words left my mouth with the force of a gavel striking wood, final and undeniable. Emily sat stunned, the brochures forgotten on the table. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Mom, I didn't know." I reached across, not to comfort her, but to steady the bridge that had begun to form between us. "Now you do," I said softly. The silence that followed was thick, but it was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of truth settling into place. That night, after she left, I walked through the house with lighter steps. The air felt clearer, the rooms brighter, though nothing had physically changed. I realized that freedom did not arrive in loud declarations or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it came quietly, in the simple act of reclaiming your own voice, of choosing not to shrink any longer. The brass key still gleamed on the mantel, but now it felt less like a weapon and more like a pendant waiting to be worn, a reminder that betrayal could be transformed into strength. The first day I walked into my classroom, my hands trembled the way they had when I was a young bride holding Richard's arm at the altar. Yet this trembling carried no fear of being judged, only the weight of a long-awaited dream finally stepping into the sunlight. The room smelled faintly of chalk and new books, and rows of simple desks gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights. My students were not children, but adults, men and women who had worked long hours in factories, in stores, in offices where their dreams had been shelved much like mine had. Their faces were lined with the same years that marked my own, and in their eyes I saw hunger, not for food, but for dignity. When I began to speak, my voice cracked, but soon it steadied, carried forward by something larger than myself. We read simple passages together. We sounded out words, we laughed at mistakes, and celebrated small victories. I realized then that teaching was not only about instruction, it was about resurrection, helping others reclaim what the world had told them they could never have. And in each of their triumphs, I found a piece of my own spirit returning. Outside the classroom, I began to build a life that belonged to me. I walked through parks with the leaves crunching beneath my shoes. I lingered in coffee shops where nobody expected me to host or smile on command. I attended community meetings where my voice mattered. Miguel, Richard's business partner, reached out occasionally, not with pity but with quiet respect. He told me stories of the projects they had worked on, how often Richard took credit for ideas that were not entirely his. And for the first time, I heard my husband described not as flawless, but as deeply flawed. Strangely, that honesty comforted me. One evening, Miguel and I met for dinner, not in some extravagant restaurant, but in a modest diner with red vinyl booths. He listened as I spoke of my students, of the joy that surged in me when a middle-aged man read his first book cover to cover, or when a grandmother wrote a letter to her grandchild for the very first time. Miguel leaned back, his eyes warm, and said, "Clara, what you're doing is more important than any building Richard ever designed." The words made me pause, my throat tightening, because they were the opposite of everything I had heard for decades. For the first time in so long, I felt seen, inspired. I began to dream bigger. What if there were a place where women like me, mothers, widows, retirees, women who had been told their usefulness had expired, could gather and learn, could support one another, could rewrite their lives? Miguel offered to help, not with grand promises, but with steady encouragement. Together, we sketched the outlines of a small nonprofit, a community center dedicated to second chances. The idea blossomed slowly, like a seed pushing through cold earth, fragile but determined. Of course, not everyone understood. Emily struggled at first. She visited less often, as if distance could protect her from the uncomfortable truth of her father's betrayal and her mother's transformation. When she did come, her tone wavered between admiration and unease. One afternoon, she sat in my kitchen watching me prepare lesson materials. "Mom," she said softly, "I used to think you were just content, that you never wanted more. But now I see you, and it's like meeting someone entirely new." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and I realized she too was mourning not just her father, but the image of her mother she had carried all her life. I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. "I was always here, Emily. I just forgot how to live for myself. Now, I'm remembering. The more I stepped into this new life, the less weight the past carried." The brass key no longer burned with betrayal when I held it. Instead, I wore it on a chain around my neck, a pendant that reminded me of survival. It was no longer a symbol of what Richard had hidden, but of what I had uncovered: the truth that even after decades of silence, it was possible to rise. People noticed the necklace, and when they asked about it, I would smile and say, "It's a key to my freedom," leaving them puzzled but intrigued. One year after Richard's death, I stood at the community college graduation ceremony, watching several of my students receive their certificates. They walked across the stage with heads high, families cheering in the audience, and tears blurred my vision. I clapped until my palms stung, my heart swelling with a pride that felt limitless. These men and women had fought battles of their own, carrying scars that could not always be seen, and yet here they were, claiming their worth. I realized that in helping them reclaim their voices, I had reclaimed mine. Later that evening, Miguel and I hosted the first meeting for our nonprofit. A handful of women gathered in a borrowed church hall, their expressions uncertain but hopeful. I told them my story, not every detail, but enough for them to see themselves reflected in my words. I spoke of years lost, of silence endured, of betrayal uncovered, and then of the fire that had sparked within me despite it all. When I finished, there was a quiet stillness, and then one woman whispered, "If you can do it, maybe I can too." That whisper spread like flame, and by the end of the night, the room buzzed with plans, laughter, and possibility. As I walked home under the soft glow of street lamps, the autumn air cool against my skin, I thought of the woman I had once been, the silent figure at the dinner table, the ghost in her own home, and I felt a surge of gratitude. Not for the suffering, but for the strength it had forced me to find. Betrayal had broken me open, but through the cracks, light had entered. The rhythm of my life shifted in ways I could not have imagined before Richard's passing. My mornings no longer began with his barked instructions or the silent weight of expectation. Instead, I woke to the sound of birds calling from the maple trees outside my window, the golden light of dawn spilling across my quilt like a quiet blessing. I brewed coffee for myself, not because someone else demanded it, but because I enjoyed the ritual, the hiss of the kettle, the aroma rising like a promise that each day could be different from the last. Teaching filled me with an energy I had believed long gone. My students arrived carrying not just notebooks, but also burdens, stories of unfinished schooling, of jobs lost, of families depending on them to do better this time. As they struggled to read paragraphs aloud or write their first essays, I saw reflections of my own struggle. We were all learning to begin again. Some evenings, as I graded their assignments under the warm glow of the lamp, I found myself smiling at the crooked handwriting, the brave attempts, the small sparks of progress. It was as if the classroom had become a garden, and I was tending fragile seeds, watching them push through the soil into fragile but determined blossoms. The nonprofit Miguel and I had envisioned slowly took shape. At first, it was only a handful of women gathered in borrowed spaces, sharing stories over weak coffee and folding chairs. But word spread. Soon, widows who had spent years in silence, single mothers balancing 2 jobs, retirees unsure what to do with their long days all began to join us. We called it Second Bloom, because each of us deserved another season, another chance to flower after years of being pruned too harshly by circumstance. I watched with awe as women stood taller, their voices steadier, as they spoke of forgotten dreams and tentative plans. Of course, there were skeptics. Some of Richard's old acquaintances raised their eyebrows when they heard what I was doing. "At your age, Clara?" one of them said at the grocery store, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Wouldn't you rather relax, travel, enjoy your retirement?" I smiled politely, but inside I thought, retirement from what? From cooking endless dinners? From keeping my opinions to myself? No, I was not retiring. I was finally living. Their words no longer pierced me. They slid off like rain against a window pane. Emily's reaction remained complicated. She came to meetings at times, sitting in the back, her sharp lawyer's gaze scanning every detail. In the beginning, I knew she was waiting for me to stumble, to collapse under the weight of responsibilities I had not carried before. But with each passing month, as she watched me teach workshops, organize fundraisers, and speak in front of groups of strangers with a confidence she had never seen, her expression softened. One evening, as we washed dishes together after dinner, she admitted quietly, "Mom, I underestimated you. I thought Dad's voice was the truth about you. I see now it wasn't." Her words were hesitant, fragile, but they wrapped around my heart like a gentle bandage. Still, healing was not linear. There were nights when I sat alone, staring at the brass key around my neck, and the old wounds reopened. Betrayal is not a cut that closes quickly. It is a scar that aches in the cold. Sometimes I wondered if Richard ever loved me at all, or if I had been nothing more than a comfortable prop in the theater of his life. Those questions could swallow me whole if I let them, so I forced myself to remember the faces of my students, the laughter of the women in Second Bloom, the softness in Emily's voice as she began to see me differently. The present, not the past, was where I chose to live. Miguel remained a steady presence. He was not a man who spoke in grand gestures, but his kindness showed in small ways, in the way he always carried extra chairs for our meetings, in the way he listened without interruption, in the way he respected my choices without trying to direct them. We never labeled what was growing between us. but when our hands brushed as we stacked papers or poured coffee, I felt a quiet warmth, not the burning intensity of young love, but the steady glow of companionship. It frightened me at times to imagine opening my heart again, yet it also reminded me that life had not finished offering me gifts. As months turned into a year, I saw transformations not only in myself, but in those around me. One woman, Helen, who had lost her husband decades earlier, finally took up painting again. Another, Patricia, who had never finished high school, passed her GED exam with tears streaming down her face. These victories were not mine alone, but witnessing them nourished me in ways words could hardly capture. We were a circle of women who had been told too late, too old, too weak, and together we were rewriting that story. Emily began inviting me into her world too. She once brought me to a courtroom, letting me watch as she argued a case with sharp precision. As I sat in the gallery, pride swelled in me, not only for her skill, but for the bridge being built between us. Afterward, she asked, "Did I sound too harsh?" And for the first time, she truly listened to my answer. "You sounded strong," I told her, and she smiled in a way that made her look like the little girl who once clutched my hand on her first day of school. On quiet nights, I sometimes walked through the garden behind my house. The roses Richard had planted years ago still bloomed, though I cared for them now. Their thorns pricked my fingers, but the petals softened the sting. They became a metaphor I carried with me. Life gives both pain and beauty, and often they grow on the same stem. I whispered my gratitude to the night air, not for Richard's betrayal, but for the strength I had found through surviving it. Without the darkness, I might never have discovered how brightly I could shine. When the anniversary of his death arrived, Emily and I visited his grave together. The marble stone gleamed in the sun, engraved with words that painted him as honorable, devoted, beloved. I stood in silence, no longer weeping, no longer raging. My heart was steady. Emily placed a hand on my shoulder, and together we laid down a single rose. "I see him differently now," she admitted. "And I see you differently too." I nodded, not needing to add more. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting, but it meant releasing the grip of bitterness so that freedom could remain. As we walked away, the brass key tapped lightly against my chest, its metallic rhythm like a heartbeat, reminding me that I was alive, that I was free, that I was still becoming. The second year after Richard's death began with a winter so cold that even the trees seemed to curl inward, their bare branches scratching the sky like brittle fingers. Yet inside me, warmth grew stronger than ever. Second Bloom was no longer just a gathering in a borrowed church hall. We had secured a small building near the town square, its brick walls weathered but sturdy, its windows glowing each evening as women came and went. Every creak of the wooden floors felt like music to me, a rhythm of footsteps belonging to those who had once believed they had nowhere left to go. I poured my heart into shaping the center. The walls soon carried bright murals painted by volunteers, depicting gardens in full bloom, birds soaring upward, and women standing hand in hand. We filled the shelves with donated books, stocked a small pantry for those who needed it, and turned one room into a computer lab where older women learned to navigate the digital world without fear of being mocked. Watching their fingers stumble across keyboards, then gradually gain confidence, was like watching toddlers take their first steps hesitant, wobbly, but filled with triumph. The work was not easy. Bills stacked high. Fundraising was exhausting, and there were nights I fell into bed with my bones aching. Doubts whispered that maybe the skeptics had been right. Maybe I was too old to carry something this heavy. But every time a woman stood in front of me with tears in her eyes, thanking me for giving her a second chance, those whispers faded into silence. Their gratitude became my fuel. Emily began to attend more often, not as a detached observer, but as an active participant. She offered legal advice to women facing housing disputes or employment discrimination, and I watched her shift from daughter to partner in this mission. One evening, after she had finished guiding a woman through complicated paperwork, she turned to me and said, "I feel like I'm seeing a side of you I never knew existed." I smiled and replied, "It was always here, Emily. You just had to look closely." Her laughter filled the room, and for the first time in years, it sounded free of judgment. Yet the journey was not without storms. At one board meeting for potential donors, an older gentleman leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Mrs. Johnson, do you really think women in their 50s, 60s, even 70s can rejoin the workforce? Society has moved past them." His words stung, echoing Richard's tone from so many dinners long ago. For a moment, my voice faltered, but then I looked around at the faces of the women in the room, each one a story of resilience. I straightened my shoulders and said, "If flowers can bloom after winter, so can we." Age is not a cage. It is a season, and seasons always change. The room fell silent, and I knew I had spoken not only for them, but for myself. Miguel remained by my side through it all. He helped with logistics, repairs, even simple tasks like setting up chairs before meetings. More than once, I caught him watching me as I spoke to a group. His gaze filled with a tenderness that frightened and comforted me at the same time. One snowy evening, after locking up the center, we walked together under the glow of streetlights. He offered me his arm, not out of dominance, but out of respect. And for a long moment, we walked in silence, our breaths rising like smoke in the cold air. At last he said softly, "Clara, you've built something remarkable, but don't forget to let yourself be happy too." The words lingered in my mind long after we parted ways. At night, as I sat in my quiet house, the brass key resting against my chest, I often reflected on how far I had come. That key had once led me into a room of betrayal, but now it felt like a compass pointing me forward. I wore it not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of survival, proof that I could transform even the sharpest wound into something luminous. And as the center grew, as more women found their voices, I realized that my story had become more than my own. It was part of a chorus, a song of resilience sung by many throats, echoing far beyond the walls we had built. Spring arrived with a softness that seemed to seep into every corner of my life. The air carried the fragrance of lilacs, the sky stretched wider and bluer, and I found myself walking more slowly, savoring the ordinary sights I once hurried past. The town square, where our center now stood, buzzed with life each evening, women gathering like bees around a hive, their conversations alive with possibility. What began as a fragile idea had blossomed into a community, and I marveled at it the way a gardener marvels at a tree, grown tall from a seed she almost threw away. Inside the center, the atmosphere pulsed with energy. One room echoed with the sound of women practicing typing, another filled with laughter as they learned to use video calls to reach grandchildren living far away. In the kitchen, volunteers prepared simple meals so that no one had to choose between learning and eating. I walked through those rooms each day with a sense of awe, as if I had stumbled into a dream I never dared to dream. Sometimes I would pause by the mural on the main wall, the one of women holding hands in a field of wildflowers, and remind myself that the painted figures were not symbols of strangers but reflections of us. Emily became a familiar presence there. Watching her shed the sharp armor of her career and lean into compassion filled me with pride. She organized workshops on women's rights, speaking with the same authority she used in court but softened with empathy. Once, after finishing a session, she pulled me aside and whispered, "Mom, I think I've been learning more from these women than they've been learning from me." Her admission brought tears to my eyes because it meant she was finally seeing the beauty I had discovered long ago, the truth that wisdom does not vanish with age, but deepens like the rings of a tree. Yet growth often comes with challenges. One afternoon, I discovered a hateful note slipped under the center's door. It sneered at our mission, calling us a shelter for failures, and mocking the idea that women past middle age could contribute anything of value. My chest tightened as I read the words, but then I looked around the room at the women bustling about, their laughter carrying like music, and I realized the note was nothing but noise. I pinned it to the bulletin board and wrote across it in bold letters, "We are not failures. We are beginnings." The cheers that erupted from the room were louder than any insult could ever be. Miguel was there that day, and when he saw me tack the note to the board, his eyes lit with admiration. Later, as we shared coffee in the quiet of the office, he said, "You've turned pain into power, Clara. That's not something everyone can do." I looked down at the brass key resting on my chest, the metal warm from my skin, and thought how true that was. Pain could destroy, but it could also forge steel in the soul. My relationship with Miguel deepened gently, like a river carving its way through stone, not by force, but by patience. He never rushed me, never demanded more than I could give. Instead, he offered presence, listening, steady encouragement. On evenings when exhaustion clung to me like a heavy cloak, he reminded me to rest, to laugh, to allow joy to be part of my healing. For a long time, I resisted the thought of romance. It felt disloyal somehow, as though loving again would erase the years I had endured. But then I realized love does not erase, it transforms. It does not deny the scars, but honors them, acknowledging the battles that carved them. One evening, after a particularly long day at the center, Miguel walked me home. The sky was painted with shades of lavender and gold, and the air hummed with crickets. As we stood at my door, he hesitated, then took my hand. His palm was warm, his grip steady. "Clara," he said softly, "you've given so much of yourself to others. Don't forget that you deserve to be cherished too." My heart trembled, not with fear but with recognition. For the first time in decades, someone was offering me love without conditions, without control, without chains. I did not answer with words, only squeezed his hand, and in that silence, a promise was made. That night, lying in bed, I thought about Richard, about the years lost, about the lies I had carried unknowingly, but instead of bitterness, I felt a quiet peace. His betrayal had been a fire that consumed the life I once knew, but from its ashes, I had risen, stronger, truer, more myself than ever. The brass key glimmered against my collarbone, and I whispered to the darkness, "You do not define me anymore." By the time summer came, Second Bloom hosted its first official graduation. Women who had doubted themselves stood proudly, certificates in hand, families cheering in the audience. I watched from the stage as their faces glowed with pride, and tears blurred my vision. The applause thundered through the hall, and I felt as if the sound itself was lifting us all higher. When the last certificate was handed out, I stepped forward and spoke from the heart. "This is not an ending," I told them. "It is a doorway. Each of you carries a key now, not of betrayal, but of possibility. Unlock the life you have waited for, and step boldly into it." The standing ovation that followed was not for me alone, but for every woman who had ever been told she was too late, too small, too invisible. As I looked out over the sea of faces, Emily among them, Miguel beside her, I knew that I was no longer just surviving. I was thriving. The woman who had once sat silent at a dinner table, shrinking under insults, had grown into someone who could stand before a crowd and speak with a voice steady as stone. My story had become my strength, and my strength had become a beacon for others. Autumn returned once again, carrying with it the familiar scent of fallen leaves and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. It was the third autumn since Richard's death, but this season no longer felt heavy with grief. Instead, it felt like a gentle companion, reminding me how cycles of loss and renewal are woven into the fabric of life. Each amber leaf that drifted to the ground seemed less like an ending and more like a promise that growth would follow. I walked often through the park near my house, the crunch of leaves beneath my shoes steadying me, and I thought of how far I had traveled within myself. The center had become a living organism, breathing with the voices of women who no longer whispered their stories, but declared them proudly. Each week, new faces arrived, women who had hidden their pain behind forced smiles, who had folded away their dreams, like delicate linens, never to be used. They came hesitant, their eyes clouded with doubt. But soon they found their place in our circle. I had begun to recognize a pattern. The first week was silence, the second week was tears, the third week was laughter. By the fourth, something shifted in them. Their shoulders straightened, their voices carried. I never tired of watching this metamorphosis, for it mirrored my own. Yet, personal transformation is rarely free of struggle. Despite the progress, there were nights when memories crept in like shadows. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and Richard's voice would echo in my mind. Who would hire a 67-year-old housewife? That sentence had once pierced me like a blade, and though I had built a new life, sometimes its sting resurfaced. Healing, I realized, was not about erasing the wound, but about carrying it without letting it control me. Each time the echo returned, I pressed the brass key to my chest and reminded myself, his words belonged to the past, my voice belonged to the present. Emily and I had grown closer, yet even closeness carried complexities. She confessed to me one evening, as we shared tea in my kitchen, that she sometimes felt guilty. I sided with Dad too often, she admitted, her voice hushed. I thought I was being practical, but I see now I was echoing him. I wish I had listened to you more. I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. We all inherit voices we don't realize we're repeating, I told her. What matters is that you see it now. Her eyes shimmered with tears, and I knew that forgiveness was flowing both ways, me forgiving her for the blindness of youth, and her forgiving herself for not seeing me sooner. Miguel remained a steady presence, but our bond deepened in ways I had not expected. He began to join family dinners with Emily, and I watched as the two of them learned to trust each other. At first, Emily's protectiveness flared, her lawyer's instincts wary of any man who stepped too close. But over time, she saw what I had come to know, that Miguel's care was not controlling, his respect not conditional. One evening, after he had helped her carry boxes of legal documents to her car, she pulled me aside and whispered, "He's good for you, Mom. I can see it." Her blessing, unspoken for so long, unlocked something in me, and I realized I had been waiting for it without knowing. Still, opening myself to love again was not simple. Some nights, fear wrapped around me like a cold blanket. I would wonder if choosing companionship now meant I had failed in some way, that I had betrayed the years of loneliness I had endured. But Miguel never rushed me. He understood that affection grows differently in older soil, slower perhaps, but deeper, its roots winding around scars and stones, finding nourishment even there. One evening, sitting on my porch beneath a sky jeweled with stars, I told him, "I'm not sure how to do this again." He smiled gently and replied, "You don't have to know, just let it happen." His words eased something inside me, like sunlight breaking through morning fog. As seasons turned, I noticed how others began to treat me differently too. Neighbors who once saw me only as Richard's widow now sought my advice. Younger women stopped me at the grocery store to ask about Second Bloom, their eyes wide with admiration. Even strangers at community events would lean closer when I spoke, as if my voice carried a weight it never had before. It felt strange at first, almost surreal, to be seen after so many years of invisibility. Yet I reminded myself that visibility is not a gift given by others. It is something we claim, and I had finally claimed mine. The most profound change, however, was within myself. I no longer defined my days by chores or by pleasing others. I defined them by meaning. Some mornings, that meaning was found in teaching a woman how to write her first email. Other days, it was in comforting someone whose grief mirrored my own. Occasionally, it was as simple as walking through the garden, touching the petals of roses Richard had once planted, and realizing they now bloomed for me. Those roses, with their thorns and their fragile beauty, became my metaphor for life itself, pain and beauty, inseparably intertwined, yet always worth tending. When Emily invited me to speak at her firm's Women's Leadership Conference, I hesitated. Standing before lawyers and executives felt intimidating, a return to the polished world where I had always been a silent wife in the background. But I accepted. On the day of the conference, I stood behind the podium, my heart hammering like a drum, and looked out over a sea of faces. I began to tell my story, not polished, not dressed in fancy words, but honest. I spoke of sacrifices made, of silences endured, of betrayal uncovered, and of the strength found in starting over. When I finished, the room erupted in applause, and several women approached me afterward, tears in their eyes, saying, "You gave me hope." In that moment, I knew my journey had rippled outward, touching lives I might never fully know. As the sun set on that day, I walked to my car with Emily at my side. She slipped her arm through mine and whispered, "I've never been prouder to be your daughter." The words wrapped around me like a shawl of warmth, banishing every shadow of doubt. For years I had been dismissed, silenced, diminished, but now I was recognized not just by strangers, but by the one person whose opinion I had always cherished most. And as I turned the key in the ignition, the brass pendant resting against my chest glimmered in the fading light. I thought of how keys are meant to unlock doors, and I realized this one had done exactly that, not just to Richard's hidden apartment, but to a future I never believed possible. Looking back now, I realize my story was never just about betrayal or about the years I lost in silence. It was about what happens when a woman decides that her life is still worth living, no matter how many seasons have passed. For too long, I believed I was invisible, a piece of furniture in my own home, useful but never cherished. But I have learned that invisibility is not destiny. It is only a cloak we can choose to shed. And when we step out from under it, we discover that the world has been waiting to see us all along. I carry scars, yes, but they no longer weigh me down. They are maps, reminders of where I have walked and how I have survived. The brass key that once unlocked a room filled with secrets now hangs around my neck as a symbol of freedom. It tells me, every day, that even the sharpest betrayal can be transformed into strength, that even the darkest night can give way to morning. If you are listening to my story and see yourself in my words, know this: it is never too late. You are never too old, too small, too forgotten. Dreams do not come with expiration dates. Your voice matters. Your presence matters. Your life matters. You are not here merely to serve or to endure. You are here to bloom, again and again, as many times as it takes. I hope my journey reminds you that pain does not have to be the final chapter. Healing is possible. Growth is possible. Joy is possible. Sometimes it begins with the smallest act, signing up for a class, speaking a truth out loud, or simply choosing to believe that you are worth more than the world has told you. And if my story touched your heart, I ask you to stay with me on this journey. Subscribe to this channel, share these stories, and help build a community where women and men too are reminded that second chances belong to all of us. Together, let us prove that life does not end with loss or betrayal. It begins again, stronger, brighter, freer, because if I, at nearly 70, can find my voice and rise, then so can you.